You are watching original video by Truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us on the web at www.truthdig.com.
Through marriage. And so you have this massive propaganda apparatus cemented into place. They have speakers bureaus, 3-minute men who go out and give talks at movie theaters. You have its own film division that are making movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. There are actually riots, when these films first premiere because people are fighting to get a seat. You have its own news division, and it becomes national policy that every single publication has to support the war. So the masses shuts down. Appeal to Reason continues to publish, but has a pro-war stance. And for a window into how terrifying and effective that propaganda is, you look at the writings of Randolph Bourne and of Adams, who hold fast to the anti-war message, because what happens is this isn't used just to promote the war. It's used to destroy all of those radical movements that had frightened the robber barons and the power elite. And those who hold out, like Debs, end up in prison. Debs finally, is arrested, although, he had pulled 900,000 votes, 6% of the vote, is arrested and put in prison for opposing the draft. And what happens, and MacDonald writes about this, is that the moment the war is over, the dreaded Hun becomes the dreaded Red. And what you enter, in MacDonald's word, a kind of an era or a psychosis of permanent war. And MacDonald says, none of the political theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, grappled with this concept of permanent war, where you're constantly fighting both the external and the internal enemy. In fact, Marx doesn't write much about war, but he writes during the Prussian War, and he actually hopes for a German victory because it will, if there's a German victory, we will come closer to having the workers' state. And I think MacDonald's right. So what becomes an effective mechanism, one, by the way, which is closely copied by the Nazis. One of the seminal texts that Goebbels uses is Bernay's book, Propaganda. I mean, there's a kind of very dark irony in the fact that the work of Bernay contributes quite directly to the murder of many of his own relatives. And it becomes all about emotion and all about the manipulation of emotion. And after the war, all of these people go straight to Madison Avenue, and they start working for corporations. And Laura Nader, who teaches at Berkeley and is Ralph's sister, when we had dinner a while ago, said something that I thought was very smart. She said, people talk about American culture, but what they're really talking about is corporate culture. And this corporate culture was instilled, this compulsion to consume, this inner compulsion to consume, the destruction of traditional values of thrift, self-effacement, replacing it with a cult of the self, with hedonism. Malcolm Cowley, in his memoir, An Exile's Return, when he writes about the culture, mostly in Greenwich Village, of the Bohemians in the 1920s and 30s, comments that although they consider themselves the Bohemians, and I think this can be a critique as well of the Beats, is that while they consider themselves outsiders, that cult of the self has infected even the left. And this coming out of the religious left, it was interesting. Although I was very young, 11, 12, I was very conscious. When my father took us to demonstrations, he would wear a clerical collar. I mean, I lived in a house where there was no alcohol. We didn't work on the Sabbath. And there was great disdain for the hedonism of the new left on the part of the religious left. That was always something that made us deeply uncomfortable. And I think that when you look back at the kind of qualities that you see in the old radicals, the pre-World War I radicals, like Mother Jones and others, that you can see exactly the kind of transformation that Cowley writes so eloquently about. And what happens is that, you know, in a functioning democracy, the liberal class is never designed to be the political left. It's designed to be the political center. And Chomsky has written about this, I think, quite well, that the goal of the role of a liberal class in a capitalist democracy is that it functions as a safety valve to make incremental and piecemeal reform possible. Karl Popper also makes this point in The Open Society and Its Enemies. And in fact, Popper has a great line, which I like. He says, the question is not how do you get good people to rule. Most people attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is George W. Bush. The question is how do you make the powerful frightened of you? And there's that wonderful scene, I think it's in Kissinger's memoirs, where it's late 1970, 71. Nixon's in the White House. There's a huge anti-war demonstration. They've ringed the White House with buses, and Nixon's standing at the window, wringing his hands, going, "Henry, they're going to break through and get us." And that's just where you want people in power to be. Right there. That's it. Conrad Black, when he writes his biography of Roosevelt, says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. And that's exactly right. That's what he did. That's what the New Deal was about. And the liberal class, as Chomsky points out, sets the parameters of the debate. So you are allowed to now, if you're, let's say a Thomas Friedman, you are allowed to question the tactics or the strategy that were employed in the invasion of Iraq, but not the virtues of those who carried out the war. The same thing, and this is Chomsky's attack on people like Anthony Lewis and others after the Vietnam War. We were naive, we didn't expect the insurgency, but you can't cross that line into the virtue, attacking the virtues, questioning the system of capitalism itself. And once you do, you end up like a Ralph Nader. You become a pariah. You are pushed out of that system. It's that, and of course what's happened, and I think, Bob would agree with me on this, is that, when I began as a journalist, when he began as a journalist, at the LA Times, there was far more space. There was far more acceptance of a range of viewpoints. And we've just watched the walls, close. So that there is no place anymore for someone like me within the New York Times. And it reminds me of what Dorothy Parker once said of Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It ranges from A to B. Well, that's sort of what acceptable political opinion in America is. It's A to B. So we saw the destruction after the war. I mean, of course, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act were used against Emma Goldman and Berkman, and the deportations, appeal to reason, even though it had supported the war, was shut down. The masses were shut down. Radical anarcho-syndicalist unions like the Wobblies were destroyed. Joe Hill, trumped-up murder charges. Big Bill Haywood, again, trumped-up murder charges, flees, spends the last 10 years of his life in exile in Moscow. And accompanying that is a disemboweling of liberal institutions themselves. Sidney Hook, a later figure, but becomes the kind of poster child for this. Hook had been a Trotskyite briefly, or flirted like a lot of people did with communism in the 30s when capitalism crashed. And because of that terror, he would name names within academia. This was in the 50s. So you have a weakening of the liberal institutions that make incremental reform possible, And you have a destruction of those populist and radical movements that have always been the true correctives to American democracy. And Howard Zinn does a very good job in his book, A People's History of the United States, explaining precisely that the creation of the American political system, and this is just this deification of the Founding Fathers just absolutely mystifies me. They did not want a popular democracy. They were slaveholders. They were fervent supporters of the genocide of Native Americans. They created mechanisms by which popular rule they felt would never be achieved. Senators were appointed, and the Senate held all the power. The Electoral College, you disenfranchise women, you disenfranchise African Americans, Native Americans, people without property. So it's essentially this white ruling class, and Zinn does a very good job. I actually taught Zinn's book in the prison. It was great because nobody in the prison system reads, so I said, I'm going to teach a course on American history, and they thought that was great. And then I just brought in boxes of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and handed them out to the inmates. And it's really moving to teach these guys, and heartbreaking, because there's always 4 or 5 in any class that are so hungry to learn, and they never had a chance ever. And you know that when they walk outside those prison doors, and they know it, they won't have a chance. They will walk back into neighborhoods not only where there are no jobs, but where anytime they fill out an employment application to work in a warehouse, or they got to check that box that says they're a felon. They know it. And when they have that kind of knowledge coupled with that kind of hunger, it just breaks your heart. This is the 3rd course I've taught in the prison, and they're not terribly disciplined. I mean, the first class, I think we talked more about the hood than we talked about anything else. But that idea of a colloquium and a seminar, that went out the door. And from then on, it was like 90-minute talks, and you have to raise your hand. But on the Zinn, I'd be teaching it, and I'd hear these inmates go, damn, we've been lied to. In this last class, when I taught Litwack, that book on Jim Crow, he won the Pulitzer for After the Storm, but I think that book on Jim Crow is a better book. It's a really amazing piece of work. And, just understanding the terror, the reign of terror that was lynching, or the amount of rape that was carried out by both white slaveholders and white males of black women after slavery. And we were going through that chapter, and one of the inmates raises their hand and goes, is this why some of us are light-skinned? And in that class, those inmates had to grapple for the first time that some of them were, of course, descended from slaveholders. Mary Chestnut, who Ken Burns quotes quite frequently in his series on the Civil War, actually writes in her diary that when she visits plantations, there were always gaggles of mulatto kids that everybody just sort of ignored. But they were all the children of the white slave owner. So the destruction of the liberal institutions, throwing people out because they're communism, which finally culminated in the McCarthy hearings. You had Elaine Schrecker's written 2 good books about this, by the way. No Ivory Tower on Academia, and I forget the name of the other one. But thousands of people lost their jobs. You had high school teachers, social workers. Social workers used to organize the union on behalf of their clients. Of course, university professors, artists, directors, Pete Seeger, with the Weavers, radio personalities, journalists. I.F. Stone becomes a pariah. Can't even get a job at The Nation, and starts I.F. Stone's Weekly in the basement. And I think at that point, then just the props are knocked out from under us, because the radical movements have been destroyed in the name of anti-communism. And I'm very critical of the New Left in Death of the Liberal Class, and because it doesn't finally bear any resemblance to the old radical left of pre-World War I. I just did a book with graphic illustrator Joe Sacco. It's called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. We've just spent 2 years on it. It's coming out in June. And when we began, the revolt was conjecture, but it was a belief that unfettered, unregulated capitalism knows no limits. And as Karl Polanyi writes in The Great Transformation, a really fine book, 1944, on what unfettered capitalism or unregulated capitalism is like, he grasps that, as Karl Marx understood, it is a revolutionary force. It in essence, commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that you exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And Polanyi, although he's an economist, actually uses the word sacred. He said, when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when nothing, including human life, has an intrinsic value, but only has a monetary value, that society cannibalizes itself until it dies, which is precisely what's happening. All, as Zinn pointed out in his book, every opening in American democracy came not through the formal mechanisms of power, but through movements. Whether it was the Liberty Party that fought slavery, whether it was the suffragists that fought for women's rights, whether it was the labor movement, and whether finally it was the civil rights movement. And you could argue that the most powerful political figure in many ways in this country, at least until he was killed in 1968, was Martin Luther King. Because when he went to Memphis or Selma, 50,000 people went with him.
This video program was brought to you by Truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us on the web at www.truthdig.com.